And I am totally fine if you all would want to interrupt with questions. I'm not sure what the chat, I see the chat function, but I'm not as familiar with WebEx, so please feel free to interject with questions. All right. No. Okay. Can you all see the presentation? Okay, perfect. So this is a co-author project with Corbin Smith at Michigan State University. And it is a project that we started when I was in grad school. And this work focuses on how we think about mass acceptance of women in politics and what it means for their candidacies. What we are trying to do in this work is methodologically we think is interesting, but also to add to the literature on how we think about where women fit in state politics and how do we reconcile the difference between states and women being able to get elected. Right. So what we know from the gender politics literature is that there is this representation gap. And many of our explanations about this representation gap go to this question of supply, right, or candidate emergence, meaning here that women are less likely to run for office, right? And so we can point to a number of explanations for this. Prominent among these are that women have personal reasons to not want to run. One reason might be having children and the time that it takes to run. But there also, we might think about socialization factors, meaning that women aren't always talked to about politics or might not think that politics are a career in which they've been oriented to take up. There's also party and ideological factors that we can think about here as well. That there is some evidence that the party is not always open to women running, right? Or they don't always select women to run. And ideologically, we know that Democratic women are advantaged in amongst their party as opposed to Republican women. So Danielle Thompson has done some really interesting work to talk about how we often don't see Republican women being supported monetarily by their party or members of their party. And so this can affect their ability to run, because we all know that being able to raise funds or being able to have money to run for office is an important part of the electoral game. There are also cultural factors that we can think about here as well, that there are some states that we might think of as going back to what we might call the older explanations of party or state culture, rather, that some states are more open to women running for office, right? And we go back to these Eleazar's measures of culture, which paint some states as being more open, paint some states as being more traditionalistic, and by and large maybe less open to women's candidacy. Now, we know that sometimes these factors might work differently for women of color versus white women. Becky Scola has done some really great work to speak to that we often see in state politics, women of color running in different places. But by and large, what we hope to accomplish with the measure that we are putting forth is some understanding of women more generally, where we're more likely to see women more generally be accepted in running for office. One less clear possibility that we don't always talk about in terms of the representation gap is a performance gap because of negative stereotypes. Right? We know that we have a supply problem, right? But we don't always talk about what happens when women do emerge. And so some scholars have pointed to there being negative stereotypes that can inhibit women from being able to run and run successfully. But there is some evidence that these gender stereotypes can sometimes be beneficial to women, or that these gender stereotypes can be trumped by party, right? So for instance, right, we might think about issues being associated with children and the home or healthcare being more likely to attract women office holders, or people being more comfortable with a woman as an office holder in these positions. There is some scholarship on that work, or that we often see Democrats being more likely to elect women than Republicans. So that's that party trumping this issue. But yet there is evidence, right, that when we largely that evidence speaks to general election context, there is evidence at the primary election context in which we see some differentials between men and women, and willingness to accept a man or a woman as a candidate. But as it stands, even though there is this evidence of a difference, or evidence of these negative stereotypes, we don't often see this evidence play out in terms of performance differentials. So one of the things that we want to get at is how might negative stereotypes matter. One prominent example we might point to is the 2016 election, right? This is a time where we might expect that people are very much willing to accept a woman as a candidate, yet, right, there was some rhetoric about a woman not being ready, or not being willing to vote for Hillary Clinton, right? And we might speak to, or there might be some other explanations around that, right? But we might argue that some of that was around gender, and gender playing a role in how people think about political leadership. Despite equal win rates, right, we do know that there are issues for women when they do run, right? So there is, in the gender politics, there exists this old adage, right, that when women run, they win, right? But what we are trying to get at is the context in which women are running and winning, right? So we know that women face more primary competition, and that women tend to run and represent certain types of constituencies. This speaks to the women-friendly district index, as an example, that women tend to run and win in districts that are more democratic, districts that are more urban, have more people of color, etc. Right? So where women are running does matter. And we think this is captured by this Dolan and Sabamatsu quote from 2009 that we've included here. And it reads, "Because women candidates and legislators are not randomly distributed across the United States, similarity in men's and women's success rates may be an indication that a level playing field exists for women candidates where they have run, rather than an indication that there's a level playing field for women in general." So for us, Corey and I, we think that this might be some indication that a measure is needed that speaks to where women are able to win. So we think about this as a state level measure, but also speaks to women's chances to run. So what I'll speak to today is not just a model, right, a results model, but also a measurement model, in which we try to think about how might we measure acceptance of women across states, and is this picking up on stereotypical attitudes? So our central question here is the problem in identifying a performance gap a function of the emergence gap? So is the supply problem a function of, or rather, is this performance gap a function of the emergence gap? And we think that examining or re-examining the negative gender stereotypes literature and its potential impact on emergence will be important here. So to put this in context, we think that women have, we recognize that there's a supply problem, but we also recognize that folks are strategic thinkers. And if they are strategic thinkers, then they are considering where they are more likely to win when they run, right? So if there is a performance gap going along with this emergence gap, then we have to think about where are women potentially thinking about being more likely to be accepted, being more likely to have seen a woman run before, or thinking that the odds are in their favor. So we think that this emergence gap is not necessarily different, or not necessarily, it is different, but not necessarily separate from this performance gap. And we think that considering how folks in the area think about women or accept women to run for office might have an impact on the supply. So as we talk about negative stereotypes, I do have to note here that what we do see over time is increased public support for women in politics. So what I'm showing you here is GSS data that speaks to how many people disagree that running a country should be left to men and disagree that women are too emotional for politics, and agree that they will vote for women nominees of their party. So this is largely suggesting that people are more accepting of women running from our measures of GSS, right? But what we do know is that women aren't running everywhere. So one of the things we have to consider here is what's happening state by state. Overall, our aggregate numbers suggest that there is support, right? But what's happening on a state by state basis that might impact what's willingness to run and acceptance at the party level. So as I've shown you, there is largely strong acceptance for women running for office, right? That people are in large part in support when we think about this over time. It's increased over time, and in aggregate numbers when we think about GSS data. But in reality, when we think about major party nominations for governor and Senate. So we use governor and Senate here because we think this is not just an indication of, a women-friendly district, right? We're thinking about state impact and the willingness of folks at the state level, within the state, to be accepting of a woman, right? Particularly when we think about party officials and their willingness to put their support behind a woman as a candidate. What we see is a very interesting picture, right? That for the most part, we haven't seen many women be nominated to be a governor or senator for the Democratic or Republican Party. So the numbers look a little bit better for the Democratic Party, but we're noticeably talking about less than a third, right? And so it's important to note that even despite there is this willingness to accept women at the individual level or amongst the public, we're not necessarily seeing that translate into politics because not many women are being nominated at the party level to run or to be the nominee rather for Senate or governor. To be a Senate representative or to be a governor, rather. So again, speaking to some of those explanations or speaking to how strategy might matter here, right? We think that there is indeed a supply problem, women's willingness to run, but we also think that we should consider the demand side as well, right? That if candidates are, again, as I suggested, being strategic about their decision to run, one of the things that they're likely thinking about is willingness to get support from the public, but also from the party, right? As I've noted, that the party is not always supportive of women running, right? I'm not necessarily suggesting that there's a sacrificial lamb story here that they are willing to let women run and see them fail, but by and large, not all women are support or receive party support. Let me give you a prominent example here that when we think about, for example, the current Congresswoman out of Massachusetts who just won, she did not receive initial party support the first time when she ran. Indeed, she didn't even receive support from the Congressional Black Caucus when she ran. They supported her opponent, who was a longtime incumbent, right, and was white, right? So she didn't receive party support. She didn't receive support from party in government, the Congressional Black Caucus, right? And yet she won, right? She beat an incumbent. And so many of the races, we might think about incumbency advantage playing in here that might inhibit the ability to run or depress the strategic entry, right? But we see an instance when a woman is entered, we might expect or hope to see some support from the party, right? Or at least some members of the party, even if, the strategic choice is to choose the incumbent, and she received none. So candidates are often strategic. We often don't see a candidate trying to enter when there is an incumbent. But in the last couple of election cycles, some candidates have kind of changed the story here. But by and large, we think about candidates as being strategic. And that matters for demand. Party elites are also strategic in their support of a nominee. So as we speak about the congresswoman who was running as a challenger to an incumbent, it wasn't very strategic for the party or party in government to support her because she was challenging a long-time incumbent. So party elites are strategic in their support of nominees as well. Right. So that's certainly an important part to think about in this demand explanation. Right. And the combination of both matter for how willing a state is to accept a female nominee for an office. Salim, did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Sure.
So for the graph that you showed us, do you have the proportion of women nominated out of those who ran to begin with?
So these are female nominees for the party. No, I don't have the proportion of those who ran. So what we're trying to get at here is whether or not the party nominated them at all. So trying to get to the state acceptance story. But that is a fair point. So given this story of supply mattering, but also the willingness of the party to accept a woman who's willing to run, we think this really fits into the story of states' acceptance of a female nominee, right? That candidates have to see a willingness amongst the public, or at least perceive a willingness, and parties have to be willing to do that as well. And by and large, we're not seeing the parties, Democrat or Republicans certainly at a lower level, but even Democrats not necessarily supporting women in a way that we might expect given the popular support. So what we try to do here, or what we do here, is estimate a multi-level regression post-stratification based dynamic IRT model, which is definitely a mouthful here. But what we are essentially doing are creating a model, or rather a measure of acceptance across states. Right. And so we're hoping to create, or what we do create, is a state opinion estimate that utilizes multiple survey items, and I'll speak to those survey items in a second, to estimate a summary of state opinion about willingness to accept women. Some scholars have used modeling practices like this to summarize opinion across items at the individual level, using a factor analytic approach or using an IRT approach, right? Others have aggregated group or state opinion or disaggregated state opinion for multiple items and then estimated a summary indicator using a dynamic IRT model, right? We try to estimate this measure dynamically using data back to the 1970s to test if they explain the observed emergence of female nominees. We recognize that there is higher acceptance. So we are not just thinking about what's happening now, right? We're trying to track what's happening over time. So we're trying to explain emergence based on willingness to accept women, or how might supply, right, match with the demand. So we recognize that we're not the first to do this. What we are trying to do is extend the methods of folks who have come before us as it fits our substantive needs here to create this measure of mass acceptance of women serving in office. So how do we get this estimation? Well, we start with a collection of survey data from the GSS. We use the GSS here, and also some Gallup data in which they ask the question about willingness to accept women. But we focus on 3 questions here. How likely would you be to vote for a woman for president? Do you think a woman's place is in the home? And do you think women are too emotional for politics? So as you can see, we have these measures over time, right? But we don't have all of these measures over time. So we are dealing with a case here in which we kind of have to be creative with the amount of data, the data that we have. So we use 3 measures here and a double smoothing approach to our IRT model in order to assist with the places where we don't have all of the data, or the years rather, where we don't have data for each measure. But we do use as a baseline for creating our measure the folks who've answered all 3 questions. So going back to how do we get our estimation, we talked about our survey data, right? We also have to think here when we're talking about IRT models is the selection and creation of state context measures. So we can think about using an IRT is not just about the public opinion itself, but supplementing that with what's happening at the state level. So we seek here to include measures of women who've served as lawyers at the state level, women in the workforce, and a couple of women in the workforce, women who are lawyers at the state level, because we recognize that being a lawyer is a pipeline to running for office. So we've included that as well. Sorry, I think I just messed this up. Turn off the wrong thing. Can you guys still see my full screen?
We see only part of it. We cannot see the slides.
Oh, that's weird. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
There we go. Okay, sorry. I think I messed something up here. And needing these measures of state characteristics we use a roughly annual basis, especially in regards to female levels of education and participation in the labor market, we rely on the annual social and economic supplement to the current population survey. And that was conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the US Census Bureau. So these surveys have mostly been conducted annually since 1962, and importantly, are stratified sampled at the state level. So with sample sizes above 800 in each state since 1977, we generated 2 types of annual state estimates: the percentage of women aged 18 to 65 that were participating in the labor market in each state, and the percentage of women aged 25 to 44 in each state that had completed a bachelor's degree or in early surveys had completed 4 years of college. So these state estimates prior to 1977 require that we make some adjustments for sampling error and missing data. We note here that the sample sizes within smaller states are times 2 small from 1968 to 1976. So the CPS combines smaller states into larger stratification sampling regions. Annual state level estimates for smaller states in these years are either noisy or non-existent. So as a result, we impute and smooth estimates of all percentages via a state space model using the sampling variance estimate to approximate the measurement error and assume a two-factor random walk transition model for a jointly shared national component and a state-specific deviation component model. So more specifically, all we did here was in creating this model, we had to bring in the public opinion data. We had to bring in these state-based measures of what's happening for women, right? How many women are in the labor force? How many are have a bachelor's degree? Because we can think about those as being factors in other models and previous research of women running or women being present in politics in other studies. Right? And we specify a random walk transition model for the national trend and a state deviation with independent normal errors. We go ahead and smooth where we have lower data or less data for specific time periods in our state space model estimates. So again, we scale those 3 items onto support for women in politics using a multi-level item response model. And we use individual and state level factors to contribute to higher or lower scores. We also take survey weights into account here. We estimate where a respondent exists on the dimension within a 2-parameter item response model specification. The many respondents in the GSS that answer all 3 items identify the scale such that respondents who need only answer one item to be included, respondents only need to answer one item to be included in the model, but we do hang our hats methodologically here on the folks who completely answered the survey. Sorry, thought my phone was on silent, but it appears not to be. So with that being said, we also take survey weights into account here because we think this is an important part of our measurement strategy. We do note that some folks do use an RT modeling approach without taking into account weights, but given that we have differences in how states are included in both our, or how many respondents from each state are included in our model, we think rather included in the survey data, we think it's important to consider here the survey weights and how they might matter for our modeling strategy. So here's our measurement model. Here's our measurement model. As I mentioned, we include some Gallup measures. In particular, they ask the question, do you think women's place is in the home? But we also have those measures from the GSS survey for fee home, fee poll, and fee pres. Sorry, yes. And so our latent factors are those individual characteristics that we talked about, such as race and gender, college education, and we also include those measures at the state level as well. We have indicators for region here, and we included year trends as well. So that's not the most interesting part of this of our project, though. This is our modeling strategy for the measurement, right? And I hope that, this might not be the most instructive for everyone, but folks do like to see it, right? So I'm showing you this, but I think the more interesting part is this, right? What comes from this modeling strategy? And what we see is that the annual estimates of state acceptance by region has changed over time, right? And there are differences by state in terms of which states are more accepting or how states have moved even now, right? That we can think about looking specifically at the Mid-Atlantic region. We see West Virginia lagging behind Maryland and New York and Pennsylvania. We even include DC here, with DC seeming to be the most accepting of women serving in office. Right? If we look at another region like the South Atlantic, we do see increase over time in terms of acceptance, but there are differences by state in terms of how that acceptance is moving. Same can be said for the Pacific, right? We see increases, but there are differences by state. Hawaii being one of those states that lags behind Oregon and California and Alaska. So this is just one view, right? We know that it's increasing. We know that some states lag behind, but one other way that we can look at this is how state acceptance has changed at different time points. So in the squares, you see 1970, the circles are 1981, the triangles are 1992, the diamonds are 2003, and the dots are 2014. So again, we see increase here, right? But there are indeed still states that lag behind. You can see Idaho here, lagging behind some other states. Connecticut here is on the higher end, right? With Mississippi on the lower end here, and New Mexico as well, right? And so we think this provides some proof of purchase of concept when we think about where women have been elected, right? We might think of a woman being elected in Connecticut versus Mississippi, for example, right? And we indeed have examples of women doing well in a state like Connecticut. And indeed, that also fits with some of these conversations around the state culture measures, right? So Connecticut would be one of those more liberal states that Eleazar initially described in his 1963 typology, right? Where Mississippi is one of those traditionalistic states where we haven't seen more women be elected. So with that being said, we have this measure, but we want to see how this measure works in whether or not we see a state party nominate a woman. So we have this measure of state acceptance now. What does that mean for whether or not we actually see nominees over time? And this model focuses on 1981 to 2014. And so we include our DV here, is state party choice of a female or male nominee for governor or US Senate. And we include variables, our measure of state opinion or our demand measure. We include the supply of women state legislators for the party because we think that's a meaningful indicator of who might be encouraged to move up. We also include other indicators for opportunity, such in other variables like party strength, open nomination, the incumbent party, the strength of the Democratic Party, whether the governor has been Democrat or Republican, whether or not a woman has previously won this position, and whether or not the current incumbent is a woman. So again, I'm showing you models both for our full sample, where we might have a woman running against an incumbent, right? Or we might have an election scenario where there is an incumbent, and we also include models where we only consider an open nomination. So there's no there's more competition here. There is no current incumbent in this role. But across our models, what we do see is that there is acceptance of, or rather, our demand measure, our state acceptance measure is significant across all of our modeling here, right? And it is in the positive direction. We also see state party supply mattering, right? And that was something that we contended as being important regardless, right? So women being in the pipeline to run is an important indicator here. But more importantly, right, the measure or demand for women being in these roles is an important indicator, regardless of whether or not it is an election scenario that is only open nomination or not, right? So, but this is a logit model, right? And indeed, I would not want to interpret these indicators on their own. So what I show you is, so we know that those indicators are significant, but I want to show you what the probabilities of female nominees are in open Senate races from when we shift from 1981 to 2014. So 1981, those estimates are in the shadows, and we are talking about Democrats, Republicans, or either here. Democrats are squares, the Republicans are triangles, and either is a circle. And we shift from the to the 2014 estimates, which are in black. So what we see here as a predicted probability of a female Senate nominee, for example, we see Republicans in California, as an example, as not being too far away from their initial estimate in 1981. This square is kind of hidden because it is behind the Republican predicted probability here, but in the shadows for 1981. But we see a shift to 2014 here for Democrats. A state that we might, so California, right, represents a state that we might expect to be more willing to nominate a woman. So that might fit with our priors here. But we can also think about a state like Mississippi, where we might be less likely to see a woman be nominated, or would be not necessarily fit with our priors of seeing a woman run and do well here. And so when we think about what's happened in the predicted probability from 1981 to 2014, we can see in the shadows here our 1981 estimates, whether or not we have a Democrat, Republican, or either be a woman nominated here is pretty low probability or predicted probability here. And when we think about what's happening in 2014, the predicted probability hasn't changed too much, right? Indeed, we never see the predicted probability rise above, sorry, let me exit, trying to get this caption off, but we never see it rise above 0.2 here for Mississippi. Another way that we might think about this is what the consequences is for each party. And so the consequences of each modeling, or each variable, rather, for Democrats versus Republicans. So what I'm showing you here is the observed change in green, right? Observed opinion change, observed changes, rather. The orange is only opinion change. The purple is only party strength change, and the pink is only women legislative change. So given these factors that we saw as significant on the other slide, right, what is really doing the work here for Democrats versus Republicans? We're starting with the Democrats in terms of the change in predicted probability from 1981 to 2014. So what we see here is that given the observed change that we've seen, right, in the predicted probability of nominating a woman, right, what has moved the most here is opinion, right? So it's not necessarily, so what we see is doing the work for the most part is opinion change, right? It's not necessarily party strength that's doing a lot of the work here, right? Or that women have been more likely to enter state legislatures that is doing the work here. It's the opinion change. Can we say the same for Republicans? Well, I'd like to show you. So what are the consequences for Republicans? Again, we see here in the green observed change. We see opinion change, only party strength change, and only women legislative change. The story looks a bit more mixed, right? A lot more complicated. But again, but opinion has shifted, right? Opinion has certainly shifted, and it is doing some work, but is not necessarily fitting with the observed change in women being nominated for these positions for Senate races. So what this might suggest is that opinion might be more in line with what's actually happening, whereas opinion is not necessarily in line with what's happening here for the Democrats, or a bit more in line. In some states, we see that it's certainly opinion has shifted way above what's happening, right? In terms of states like Hawaii, where this is where what's happened in terms of the predicted probability of seeing a woman in a Senate race, and where opinion is here, right? So it would appear that there's room for growth, right, for what's happening for the Republican Party. And what we see on the Democratic side is that what's happening is that more women are running, but the opinion is here across states. The only state where we see opinion, be farther along than what's actually happening in the state, or what's predicted to happen into the state in terms of predicted female nominees, is in Vermont. Oh, sorry. So what do we have here? What can we say about this? Well, I think what we can say is that state opinion does predict the likelihood that a woman will be a nominee for a statewide office. What I think is important to consider here is how statewide opinion is following along with the actual story of emergence. In some places it fits very well, but in other places it doesn't, right? We suggest that our measure might be an indicator of negative gender stereotypes, right? And so what we think is happening here is that, there are places where more women are emerging because they think that it's a safe place to run, or that their strategic decision-making would suggest that they can and should run. But opinion is not necessarily in the place that we would expect it to be for women to be emerging and running in some of those spaces, particularly when we think about the Democratic Party, which has largely been the space to see women be supported to run for office. We think the largest story is about strategic behavior, both when women choose to enter the race and when parties choose to support them. So we see this conflicting story here about what's happening for candidates themselves, thinking that reading the room, for lack of a better term, and seeing the space in which the layout for whether or not they might be accepted to run, and the layout that parties are seeing and their willingness to accept a candidate to run. And we see those as being almost in conflict, right? And we think that matters for women continuing to run and do well in some of these spaces. And that when we think about the fact that there is still a representation gap, we need to think about what's happening between mass acceptance and what party elites are thinking about. And we think that the measure is likely capturing the idea or what party leaders might be thinking about what's happening at the state level. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. Sorry about the mishaps there. This is my first time using WebEx in a talk, so I think there was something in the chat. If you all want me to answer that first. How do I stop sharing? Okay. Looks like. Are you looking at the relationship between female participation in local level politics, such as school boards, cities, town councils, and female participation at higher level state positions, governor, senator, states, legislature? That was a question from David Mitch. David, thank you for the question. What we include in our modeling here is just the capacity in the state legislature. So we're not necessarily capturing those lower level offices. we're simply capturing who is in the state legislature or the percentage of women in the state legislature at the time, because some of the evidence from the literature suggests that women in that pipeline, or who have at least made it to the state legislature, may likely think about moving up to higher office.
Could I follow up since I asked the question? So
Sure.
I can think of sort of you could tell a developmental model where first women sort of enter at the local level, then that sort of sets the foundation for more women at higher levels. And I don't know if you have the data for that, how hard it is to get the data for local level positions, but it seemed to me interesting, like to compare Mississippi and Connecticut regarding women's participation at the very local level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. What has been difficult is that the data is not as available for local level offices. I wish it was because I would certainly love to use it, but some as best we have is from the Center for American Women in Politics, and they've been really great about collecting data on large cities. So we have the top 100 cities and some of the bigger cities that are not necessarily fitting into the top 100, but we don't have all the information on those locales when we think about counties, right, and the composition of those. That data has been a bit harder to get. But I think you make a really good point here, and my dream project is to collect that data. I'm sure it would give me a lot of citations. I'm sure folks would be really interested in having it for themselves.
So let me ask a question.
Sure.
When you showed us these changes over time,
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if we could plot 2014 versus 1981 to see whether the states that started from a higher level of acceptance actually ended up even higher than that, while the states started lower, remained lower, or do you see sort of a more negative relationship? Eyeballing, it looked to me more positive relationship, but
Mm-hmm.
is that your impression, or you think?
Yeah, so I think it is the case that most states have increased in their acceptance towards women, but some states have done it more than others, right? So it is a positive story that the states are more accepting of women, but I think it's to various degrees that some states are more accepting than others.
I guess my question, compared to the original point, compared to 1981, do you see convergence in terms of by how much the acceptance has increased? Or do you feel that those states that were accepting women more in 1981 have it become more so in relative terms to the states that were accepting women less?
So I think it's certainly a situation of states that were more accepting have become more accepting over time, and states the states who are less accepting are catching up, but they're not necessarily in the same place.
Okay, so the gap's basically now bigger than they used to be. Okay. And the other thing, I mean, when I look at the graph, speaking of parties, I do see most of the states, maybe not surprising, most of the states with lower acceptance are Republican or red states. The question is, if you were to look at like the same analysis for Democrats, but also take into account the share of the Republican vote in these, 2014 was of course a midterm election, and try to see if that has to do with the share of Republicans' votes in each of these states, to see if that played a role in the nomination or the voting for. I know that you're not looking for who won the election, but who was nominated. Mm-hmm. But we know that 2014 was a bad year for Democrats. So the question, specific to 2014, the question, if you could look maybe at the share of Republican vote, Democrat vote, and then see if that sort of somehow correlated with the degree of acceptance for Democrats specifically.
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is for both just party nomination, not necessarily outcomes on the general election side, right? Where we think that there were certainly being big differentials in some of these Republican states for nominating a woman and being given that we tend to see women being Democratic candidates. What we are capturing here, or what we think we're capturing here, or what we hope to be catching here is what is happening at the party level. So who are they nominating for their party nominee, right? And we think that for the governor level races and the Senate races are instructive, because regardless of whether we think that Democrats are likely to win in a state like Mississippi, they're still going to nominate somebody. Versus, at a state legislative level, we see a lot of open or rather uncontested races, because folks know that a state like Mississippi, unless it is a strongly Democratic district, we aren't going to see any competition there. So
I think part of what I'm trying to say is that sometimes the environment matters.
yes.
So who are we gonna nominate? So if you take the 2020 elections, I mean, maybe nobody other than Biden could have won, probably. So you look at the environment, and based on that, you ask yourself, can we win with a woman on the top of the ticket in 2020, in 2014? Because that could play a role in who we're going to nominate. So I think that's what I'm trying to say. The environment matters. 2008 is different from 2014.
Yeah, so I think that that's what we are trying to get at with the demand measure, or the MRP measure of state acceptance, right? And I think there's been some more work here that's spoken to these types of election-based considerations that folks tend to make based on the candidate. I think what we are trying to get at overall is if even within a state like Mississippi, are we going to see folks be willing to accept a woman, or what does state acceptance look like overall? But I take that point as being very valid, because I think there is some certainly good work that's spoken to those election-based considerations that folks are making based on who they think what they think other people are going to do. So I think that might I think that still speaks to this state acceptance, though, because I think that even if folks are thinking about I think that might speak to the differential that we see this happening, that even when state acceptance is high, right, we aren't necessarily seeing women being nominated in certain places. I think there's a question by David Mitch. Would it be feasible to look at effects from national level nomination of women for VP, Ferraro and Palin, down to the state level? David, that's a really good question. I think that we could. I think we started with the state level because we were hoping to see the proof of purchase for our state level measure, but I think that we could validly do this, use the same measure for demand for national level elections if we are considering what's happening state by state. Thank you for that question. And then David Coates, I think I missed it, but can you say anything about regional differences in likelihood of nominations of women? If you all wouldn't mind me sharing my screen again, I showed a state by state picture, but there's also room to think about regional differences here, just thinking about the measure. And so what I'm showing you here is how region by region, there are notices, or rather labels here for states, not notices, labels for states. But region by region, what I'm showing you here is what's happening in terms of percent of people who are, or these annual estimates of acceptance for women here. So, you know, there, as I mentioned before, there's certainly increases across states, but there are differences, or rather, increasing acceptance of women across regions, rather. But there are differences by state in terms of how much they are increasing over time. And I pointed to West Virginia and Hawaii as examples here. I hope that helps.
It does, kind of.
Okay.
So you've used the census definitions of regions here, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be more interested in something like the states of the Confederacy versus the states of the Union, that sort of thing, than these regionals, because you kind of mix what you might think of as the red states and the blue states to some extent. And I just kind of wonder if there's a difference there.
Oh, that's fair. So when we're just looking by state, I know it's not exactly what you're looking for, right? But if we're just looking state by state and how things have changed, this is Mississippi, right? Confederacy state. This is Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia, right? And here is Connecticut. This is Vermont, right? Pennsylvania. Sorry, I'm trying to remember my the Union states here. So I think there are still those differences here that you were speaking to in terms of acceptance, but not necessarily. But I take your point that it's not necessarily in the format that you would have preferred to see.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Fernando. Oh, hi, Fernando. How are you? Thank you. He says fascinating work. I'd be interested in seeing whether the presence of women's advocacy groups might support supply. Kenneth Andrews' book on the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement argues that the movement was an important force in pushing Black candidates to run for office and get elected. So, Fernando, that's a really great question. We don't necessarily account for it here, but it is a factor that I'm trying to account for in my book project, where I'm trying to get at state level factors that have mattered for emergence, in particular for Black women, in relation to other groups. So I take that point very seriously, and I think that's an important point to include. We don't necessarily include it here, but I definitely appreciate the point you're making. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Not a question, just a snarky comment. I wonder if in 10 years, if you go and you ask people about whether women are too emotional, having lived through 4 years of Donald Trump as president, if that will have much of an effect on the answer.
So I think that's a good question. We have been thinking about updating this work to include those additional years, because we stopped at 2014. But I think I think that we might see some changes here. Although I think that there will be some partisan differentials, certainly. I just want to thank you all for your time and your questions. I really appreciate your engagement with this work. And particularly on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. And it was a very good timing for this.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you again for doing it, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. You all as well.
And we hope to have you in person when everything is back to normal.
I would certainly enjoy that.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.